was crisp, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant murmur of a flowing river. The rugged terrains of the Canadian Rockies stood tall against the horizon, their snow-capped peaks glistening in the soft light of dawn. Nestled amidst the towering mountains and dense forests was a solitary figure, a man seeking solace in isolation. David Thompson, a 30-year-old software engineer from Toronto, had decided to disconnect from the chaotic urban life and embark on a solo hiking expedition through the Rockies. Driven by the desire to escape the relentless demands of his job and a recently failed relationship, David sought refuge in the calming embrace of nature. His backpack, laden with essentials and a few comforts, was his sole companion on this journey. As David trekked along the winding trails, he marveled at the serene beauty that surrounded him. The rustling leaves, the chirping birds, and the gentle caress of the breeze were a stark contrast to the blaring horns and incessant chatter of the city. He felt invigorated, his steps light and his heart unburdened. Stopping at a clearing, David decided to set up camp for the night. He pitched his tent with practiced ease and built a modest fire, watching as the flames danced and crackled. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The tranquility was almost surreal. As night fell, David settled into his tent, the soft glow of his lantern casting a warm light on the pages of a book he'd brought along. The sounds of the wilderness were a soothing lullaby, lulling him into a sense of security. However, unbeknownst to David, his presence in the forest had not gone unnoticed. A pair of eyes observed him from the darkness, watching his every move with a predatory intensity. The eyes belonged to Richard Walker, a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of locals and whose dark deeds had earned him a place in whispered stories and hushed conversations. Known as the Hunter of the Rockies, Richard was a notorious serial killer, adept at tracking and toying with his prey before delivering the fatal blow. Richard studied David from his concealed vantage point, a sinister smile playing on his lips. In the solitude of the forest, a deadly game of cat and mouse was about to begin, and David was blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond the comforting glow of his campfire. The morning sun rose lazily over the Rockies, its rays filtering through the canopy and casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. David awoke to the sound of birdsong, the previous night's tranquility still lingering in the air. He stretched, feeling the cool morning breeze on his face as he exited his tent. After a hearty breakfast of instant oatmeal and freshly brewed coffee, David packed his belongings and continued his trek deeper into the wilderness. The trail led him through dense underbrush, along the banks of a glistening river, and up steep inclines. With every step, the vestiges of civilization seemed to fade further away, and David revelled in the isolation. As the day wore on, David began to notice oddities that seemed out of place in the serene landscape. First, it was a scrap of torn fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. Curiosity piqued, he examined it, wondering if another hiker had passed this way. Dismissing it as inconsequential, he pressed on. Further along the trail, David stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. A tent, battered and half-collapsed, lay forlorn amidst the foliage. Scattered belongings, a backpack, a pair of boots, and a rusted camping stove, suggested a hasty departure. An unsettling feeling crept into David's mind, and he scanned the surroundings with newfound wariness. Choosing to investigate, David cautiously approached the abandoned tent. Inside, he discovered a small weathered journal. Flipping through the pages, he found entries from a fellow hiker chronicling their journey through the Rockies. The entries spoke of breathtaking vistas and peaceful nights under the stars. But the tone shifted abruptly towards the end. The last few pages were filled with hurried scribbles describing the feeling of being watched and an ominous presence lurking in the shadows. A chill ran down David's spine as he read the panicked words. His gaze darted around the abandoned campsite, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was trespassing on a scene of a sinister mystery. Deciding it was best to move on, he pocketed the journal, intending to report the find to the authorities once he returned to civilization. As David continued his hike, the sense of isolation that had once been comforting now felt oppressive. The rustle of leaves and snap of twigs underfoot seemed amplified, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Unbeknownst to him, Richard, the hunter of the Rockies, trailed him at a distance, reveling in the fear that he sensed growing in his prey. David quickened his pace, eager to put distance between himself and the abandoned campsite. But with every step, he was drawn deeper into a web of terror, spun by a predator skilled in the art of fear. As the afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense foliage, David's sense of unease grew. He couldn't shake off the eerie discoveries at the abandoned campsite, and the unsettling words from the found journal replayed in his mind. The once soothing sounds of the wilderness now seemed like whispers in a language of warning. David decided to find a suitable place to set up camp earlier than planned. A sense of urgency propelled him as he scanned the surroundings for a safe haven. Eventually, he stumbled upon a small clearing beside a swiftly flowing stream. It seemed as good a spot as any. Quickly, he set up his tent and gathered firewood, seeking comfort in the routine tasks. As the fire crackled and embers danced in the evening breeze, David tried to dismiss his fears as products of an overactive imagination. He told himself that the Rockies were vast, and the chances of crossing paths with anyone, let alone someone dangerous, were slim. However, unknown to David, his every move was being observed with keen interest. Richard, the hunter of the Rockies, had been biding his time, reveling in the fear he had instilled in his unsuspecting prey. He knew the wilderness like the back of his hand, and he had perfected the art of stalking silently, blending seamlessly into the shadows. As night descended, David settled into his tent, his ears straining for any out-of-place sounds in the cacophony of the nocturnal forest. Sleep remained elusive, and he found himself jumping at the slightest noise. The isolation he had sought now felt like a cage, and the vastness of the wilderness seemed suffocating. Outside, Richard decided it was time to escalate his twisted game. With deliberate slowness, he approached David's campsite. Stealthily, he moved around the perimeter, leaving subtle signs of his presence. A snapped twig here, a faint footprint there. In the dead of night, David's heart raced as he heard soft footsteps circling his tent. Panic gripped him, and he fumbled for the flashlight, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. He unzipped the tent flap cautiously, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. David knew now that he was not alone, and that his pursuer was playing a cruel game. The hunter had made himself known to his prey, and the terrifying realization struck David like a bolt of lightning. He was being hunted. Fear had lodged itself firmly in David's chest, making each breath laborious. His senses were on high alert as he scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of his unseen pursuer. The moon hung in the sky like a cold, indifferent eye, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. Realizing the danger he was in, David knew he had to act quickly. He hastily packed his belongings, extinguishing the fire and leaving the clearing with a sense of urgency. Every instinct told him to flee, to find his way back to civilization and escape the twisted game he had become a part of. The forest seemed to come alive with malevolent intent. Branches seemed to reach out to snag his clothes, and rocks appeared in his path as if placed there to trip him up. David stumbled forward, driven by adrenaline and fear, with the chilling realization that he was being stalked by a predator well versed in this deadly game. Meanwhile, Richard reveled in the chase. He was a shadow, a ghost, effortlessly trailing his frantic prey. He knew every nook and cranny of these woods, and he took pleasure in watching David's desperate attempts to escape. But Richard wanted to prolong this game, to savour the fear, and so he remained a silent observer, always close but just out of sight. As dawn began to break, casting a soft, treacherous light on the landscape, David's exhaustion caught up with him. His breath came in ragged gasps and his legs felt like lead. But survival instinct overpowered fatigue, and amidst the panic, a spark of determination ignited within him. David knew he had to turn the tables on his pursuer. His survival depended on outsmarting the hunter, and he tried to think strategically. Frantically, he recalled every survival tactic he had ever read or seen. He began to take erratic paths, doubling back on his tracks, and using the stream to mask his scent. He created false trails and makeshift traps, anything to confuse or delay his pursuer. As the day wore on, Richard realized that his prey was not as easy to corner as he had thought. The chase was taking longer, and the trails were becoming harder to decipher. A flicker of frustration crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a sinister grin. The game was becoming more interesting, and he was all the more eager to win. David, driven by desperation and newfound resolve, pressed forward. The roles of hunter and hunted were not as clearly defined now, and the wilderness bore witness to a deadly dance between two determined individuals. The game was escalating, and neither was willing to concede defeat. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the deadly chase continued, the tension palpable in the very air. David, driven by a potent mix of fear and determination, pushed himself to his limits. His every thought was focused on survival, on outwitting the relentless predator on his trail. As the afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor, David stumbled upon a steep cliffside. The rocky expanse offered a panoramic view of the vast wilderness, but more importantly, it presented an opportunity. A treacherous path led down the cliffside, a path that could easily be missed if one were not paying close attention. Without hesitation, David decided to take the risk. He navigated the steep descent with utmost caution, aware that one misstep could lead to a fatal fall. Loose rocks and gravel slid underfoot, and he clung to the sparse vegetation for support. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from exertion but from the hope that this dangerous path would serve as a means to shake off his pursuer. Richard, in hot pursuit, noticed the sudden disappearance of David's tracks. He scanned the surroundings, frustration mounting as he realized that his prey had found a way to elude him. His eyes narrowed, and he scrutinized the landscape with a predator's keen gaze. After a few tense moments, he spotted the precarious trail down the cliffside. A smirk played on his lips as he admired David's ingenuity, but his resolve to catch his prey only intensified. Back at the base of the cliff, David knew he couldn't afford to slow down. He quickly set a few more misleading markers to throw Richard off his trail, and continued his frantic escape through the thick underbrush. The forest began to change as David pressed on, the dense trees giving way to a more open terrain. Soon he found himself on the outskirts of a small secluded village. Relief washed over him at the sight of civilization, but he knew he couldn't let his guard down just yet. Wasting no time, David sprinted towards the village, desperate to find help. His breaths were ragged and his limbs ached from the relentless exertion, but fear and adrenaline propelled him forward. Meanwhile, Richard emerged from the forest, his face contorted with rage as he saw his prey nearing safety. The chase was reaching its climax, and he knew he had to act quickly. The village, oblivious to the life-and-death chase unfolding at its doorstep, was about to become the backdrop for the final confrontation between the hunter and the hunted. David's desperate sprint carried him into the heart of the secluded village, each gasping breath echoing his frantic heartbeat. The village, a quaint collection of rustic cabins and well-tended gardens, seemed almost idyllic, belying the terror that had driven him there. Without pause, David burst into the village square, his frantic cries for help cutting through the peaceful afternoon air. Startled villagers emerged from their homes, concern etched on their faces as they took in the sight of the dishevelled and panicked hiker. "Help! Please!" David panted, his voice hoarse and trembling. "There's a man. A killer. He's after me." The village, quick to respond to the urgency in his voice, sprung into action. Sturdy men grabbed tools that could double as makeshift weapons, while others hurriedly ushered children and the elderly indoors. The tranquil village had transformed into a hive of protective vigilance. Richard, having followed David to the edge of the village, hesitated at the sight before him. His eyes darted between the determined villagers and his prey, now surrounded by a protective barrier of people. The hunter, so accustomed to stalking solitary prey in the isolation of the wilderness, found himself outmatched. From a distance, he watched as David, now safe amongst the villagers, pointed in his direction, his voice a mix of fear and relief. The villagers' eyes followed David's outstretched hand, and their gazes locked onto Richard. Realization dawned on them, and their faces hardened with resolve. Cornered and outnumbered, Richard knew the game was up. He turned on his heel, disappearing back into the forest from whence he came. The villagers gave chase for a short distance, ensuring that the threat had truly retreated, before returning to assess and comfort the shaken hiker. Back in the village, David, still trembling from the ordeal, was met with comforting words and reassuring pats on the back. The villagers, a tight-knit community unaccustomed to such drama, rallied around him, offering warmth and safety. The village sheriff promptly contacted the authorities, relaying the harrowing tale and providing a description of the elusive hunter of the Rockies. The ordeal had finally come to an end, and the village, once a mere waypoint in David's journey, had become his sanctuary. As night fell, the village returned to its peaceful state, albeit with a heightened sense of vigilance. David, wrapped in a blanket and seated by a comforting fire, couldn't help but marvel at the resilience and kindness of the community that had saved him. The hunter had lost his game, and David, once the hunted, had found solace and safety amongst strangers who had quickly become his protectors. The nightmare was over, and the dark shadows of the Rockies were left behind, at least for now.